Hello and good afternoon. I just want to give everyone a few minutes to log on to our webinar. Again, thank you for joining. We're going to go live in 1 to 2 minutes. We're just giving attendees time to join. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the AHRI Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force webinar. This webinar today will cover servicing A2L refrigerant systems. Very excited today for you to join us. We have 3 industry experts who are going to bring to you information that will cover service requirements, recommendations, and best practices for A2L refrigerant systems, as well as an opportunity for you to give us some Q&A from the attendees. Our first speaker today is Jason Obzutz. He is the Director of Industry Standards and Relations for the ESCO Group. Jason is a certified master HVACR educator. He currently serves on numerous industry committees, including the AHRI Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. He's also the co-author of Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Technology, the industry's leading textbook published by Cengage, as well as the author of the ESCO titles, Gas Heating and Low GWP Refrigerant Safety. Then we're going to hear from Michael Laguilla, Director of International Affairs at AHRI. Michael joined AHRI in July 2015, and he is the Director of International Affairs and supports AHRI's activities following global climate change, energy efficiency, and trade policies. He coordinates relations with foreign trade associations, U.S. embassies, and global regulators of HVACR and water heating equipment. And topping out the hour, we're going to hear from Tony Spagnoli, Director of Training and Education of the North American Technician Excellence Program, also called NATE. He's been with NATE for over 10 years. He manages all of NATE's certification testing, continuing education programs, recertification, and customer service. Tony is responsible for reviewing questions for the NATE exams, identifying questions that need to be reworked or replaced, and he also has a BS in political science from James Madison University. And one more item I'd like to share with you folks is the fact that we have the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. We'll be going over that at the end of this presentation to share with you additional resources. But right now, I'd like to hand this over to Jason.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I believe I covered all of the time zones there. You can go ahead and move the presentation up one, please. So today we're going to discuss some A2L refrigerant related things and what it's all about. We're going to discuss today some of the requirements, things that are required in the codes and standards, recommendations, and industry accepted best practices. And we'll identify them as we go through the slides. We'll point out this is a recommendation, this is a requirement, this is a best practice. So pay attention to when we drop those little nuggets in there. Okay. I'm going to be driving the bus for this portion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. We'll do our best to address them. Standards, codes, and guidelines for system service or installation can vary from one building occupancy to another. Some of the more common classifications that we see in codes and standards are commercial, industrial, large mercantile, institutional, public assembly, and residential. During this presentation, we're going to do our best to kind of sum up so far what some of these requirements are and what some of the recommendations are surrounding some of these occupancy classifications. Next. We're going to start with, as we always should, job site safety. Now, the things that we're going to point out here are best practices, recommendations, and requirements for working on a job site. As with any refrigerant, not just specifically to A2Ls, but any refrigerant, the accumulation of any refrigerant in a confined space can displace oxygen and lead to suffocation. The accumulation of a flammable refrigerant in a confined space can lead to ignition if a viable ignition source is present. Prior to beginning any work, the job site itself should be evaluated for safety hazards such as possible ignition sources or the presence of flammable vapors prior to beginning the work. One of the things that we see in everyday life when we're driving around, we'll see the electrician or the phone guy or the internet guy, when they have their van out there, they tend to put the cones out to designate a little work area. This practice can carry over into our industry. It is recommended to put designate a safe work area using cones or construction hoses or horses rather, or barriers. Again, it's not a requirement, but it's a recommendation. We see many of the other trades and workers in the field doing such things, and I think it's something that we as an industry can adopt. Next. When we're installing 2L equipment, A2L equipment, we need to make sure that the equipment is approved for installation and use in the designated area or space. Now, this is typically found in the manufacturer's literature. The manufacturer's literature is going to become very important. For a long time. It was used as a kneeling pad, or we would use it to make a parts list to send somebody to the supply house. But more and more, the information that's being put into these installation manuals, these service guides from the manufacturers, we really have to pay attention to. And in these particular guides, we're going to find where we can use them, where we can't use them, under what conditions. So when we are going to install any piece of equipment, 2L or not, we should look to the manufacturer's literature to make sure that it's approved for installation in that area. When installing any piece of equipment, especially those containing flammable refrigerants, we want to make sure that the system is properly grounded. This is the same whether it's an A1 or an A2L. We always want to make sure that when we're installing it, the system has a proper ground. This is for safety reasons. Can you move up? The installation for A2Ls and A1s, they're similar. I'll put this out there that the systems that we're going to see on the residential side, especially residential and light commercial, they're not going to look too different from the units that we're installing today, the A1s. There may be some labels on there, some stickers on there, but all in all, they're going to look very similar to the units that we're installing already. And if we're following industry best practices, the installation of these units is not going to be too different from what we're already doing. Many of the differences between an A2L and an A1 system installation are pre-installation safety precautions that primarily involve evaluating the installation site, making sure that the equipment is approved for and proper for this particular installation site. And again, the best place to find that type of information is going to be the manufacturer's installation guide. The authority having jurisdiction for the specific area that you're doing the install in will also be able to provide you guidance as to installation, if it's proper or not. Go ahead and move up. Thank you. The maximum charge size, this is something that needs to be addressed. The maximum charge size for A2L equipment will be limited by the cubic feet of airspace that is served by the equipment. So not only do we have to size the equipment for the structure properly as to BTUs per hour and things like that, but we also have to make sure that the space itself can accommodate this equipment. The space must be large enough and have enough air to keep the refrigerant at or below a percentage of the lower flammability limit, or LFL, should the entire charge leak into the space. Similar to other refrigerant systems, A2L systems must be evacuated prior to being charged. The vacuum pump should be rated for use with A2L refrigerants. Again, the best place to get information, you're going to hear me repeat this over and over during this presentation, the best place for information on this is from the manufacturer's literature, the installation manual or the service guide. But this is no different from the A1 systems. We're evacuating this system prior to being charged. Next. Some manufacturers may recommend that if a system was previously charged with an A2L refrigerant and there's oil present in the lines, that the system be flushed with dry nitrogen prior to evacuation. This is sometimes referred to as a nitrogen sweep. And this is, again, to help remove any refrigerant that may be entrained in the oil. Some manufacturers also may require that their A2L equipment be triple evacuated. This can vary from one manufacturer to the next. The industry accepted standard for a quality deep vacuum has typically been 500 microns. There's some debate on that, but the accepted standard is 500 microns. Now, some manufacturers may require a different target for their equipment. And I'll say it again, the best place for finding that information is going to be in the manufacturer's installation manual. I want to let everybody know before I start this next slide that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website after the presentation in the next few days. So if you missed something, if I went too fast, this is being recorded and it will be posted later. Moving on to charging. While the process of charging an A2L system is the same as charging any system, there are some important safety factors that we have to take into consideration. Charging a system with an A2L refrigerant must be done carefully to ensure that the maximum allowable charge weight is not exceeded. Now, here's something that I like to point out. The maximum allowable charge is not a universal figure, and it's going to vary from one system installation to the next. Again, there'll be charts that we're going to, we'll look at some sample charts in a little bit that are published in the manufacturer's literature to guide you in charging. So we're used to looking at airflow charts. We're used to looking at charging charts. This will be another chart in the manufacturer's installation literature to help you determine what the maximum allowable charge is for this particular installation. Next. All right, staying with the charge. In the standards and the industry best practices, we've identified, where allowable by code, two different charges for an A2L system. They are called the M1 and the M2 charge. All right. The M1 charge is a charge without mitigation strategies installed. And the M2 charge is when we have mitigation strategies installed. And let me take a second to discuss what mitigation strategies are. Mitigation strategies can be active room sensors that turn on ventilation, that force the unit into a pump down. They have control logic that can turn things on and off to help mitigate any refrigerant leak that may be present. Some systems may come from the factory with mitigation pre-installed, some may not. We may have to evaluate the installation area to determine whether or not mitigation is required. But it should be noted that when you see the term M1 and M2, this is something new to us. M1 is a charge for the unit without any kind of additional components or things installed. And the M2 charge is when we have mitigation installed. And again, that could be ventilation or a pump down using a solenoid or turning a fan on, something along those lines. Next. Here's an example of what we had spoke of earlier, a charging table that we may find in manufacturer's literature. It lists the cubic feet of the space and the allowable charge for the system. And again, this is based on some of the information, the formulas and things that are available in the soon to be published AHRI 15.2 standard. So there will be charts like this that list cubic feet of space, allowable charge. There will also be charts that list, okay, how long is the line set, how much additional refrigerant needs to be added to the system, and what's our maximum allowable line set for this particular unit. So they'll be easy to read charts like we've been using for years in our industry with airflow charts and charging charts. The information will be contained in the manufacturer's literature in an easy to read format like this. Next. Manufacturers are required to print model-specific charging information in the literature. Some of the variables that can affect the allowable system charge are the system design and capacity, the length and size of the refrigerant piping, the indoor cubic volume, and the occupancy classification of the structure. So there are some variables, as we mentioned earlier, that the charge is not going to be the maximum allowable charge, is not going to be a specific number for every unit. It is going to vary from one installation to the next. And these are just some of the variables that can affect how much a system can hold. Moving on with charging, again, another recommendation is locking refrigerant caps. A2L refrigerant cylinders, we know will be color-coded gray with a red stripe. And we'll point out that while it's recommended that these cylinders have a 1/4 inch left-hand thread, there may be some cylinders out there with a 1/4 inch right-hand thread. So again, locking caps should be placed on the unit after it's charged and installed. The refrigerant cylinders that we're going to be using to charge this particular unit will be color-coded gray with a red stripe. And we should get used to seeing different threads on either the unit or the tank or both. Once the cylinder is empty, the disposable refrigerant cylinder, we would recover any residual refrigerant from the cylinder and render it useless. And by rendering it useless, we're talking about puncturing it with, in this case, a non-sparking pick. This is an industry best practice. Now, traditionally, there would be a little ring at the top, which is a form of a safety, and we would puncture it up there. These newer refrigerant tanks are not going to have that type of relief valve at the top. They're going to have a different relief valve. So it's recommended that you do not attempt to puncture the relief valve. You can see in the image where we're puncturing it there in the center of the tank. Moving on to repairs. A2L systems will be designed with electrical components that are called intrinsically safe. This may be a new term for some of us, it may not. Simply stated, intrinsically safe components such as the contactor or capacitor are designed to be enclosed, which isolates the electrical contacts from the atmosphere. So typically when we're working on an air conditioner or heat pump or refrigeration unit and we see that contactor engage, you're used to seeing that little arc from the contacts making, and intrinsically safe, that will all be housed and enclosed so that we wouldn't see it anymore. If a heat or a spark is generated, it'll be contained within the protective closure. This will prevent these components from being a possible ignition source if there is a leak of an A2L refrigerant. So again, we're going to see the same components, contactor, capacitor, those sorts of things, but they will have enclosures to prevent them from being a possible ignition source. When performing repairs on the system, start by ensuring the unit is grounded. Again, when we discussed doing the install, as the installer, we made sure that the unit was grounded. As a service technician, you're again going to make sure that the system is grounded before we touch it. The industry accepted method for discharging capacitors from even when I got into the industry has been to short it with a screwdriver. We want to change that mind thought. We want to use the manufacturer's recommended way, which is to use a resistor. We want to discharge it in a way that will not cause a spark. If it is a sealed component like a contactor or a capacitor, we want to make sure that after we're done servicing, that we reseal any of the enclosures that were originally on there. So we put the unit back in play like it was when we came to it. Next. Recovery. A2L refrigerants are still under the purview of 608 and still must be recovered. Before we open up a system, we have to recover these refrigerants. The tools used for recovery of A2L refrigerants must be rated for use with A2Ls or flammable gases. There are a lot of manufacturers that are making tools rated for flammable refrigerants, A2Ls, or even A3s. Technicians should refer to the EPA recovery efficiency chart, for target recovery levels. Now, for those of us that it's been a while since we took the 608 exam, one of the things that we had to study was the recovery efficiency chart. And on there, it tells us what the target is, when our recovery is finished. And it's based on how much refrigerant is in the system and what the pressure is of that refrigerant. Is it a low pressure, high pressure, very high pressure? So you might have to do some homework. When we're finished recovering an A2L refrigerant, again, as we mentioned earlier, we want to do that nitrogen sweep, which will remove any residual refrigerant vapor that may be entrained in the refrigerant oil. This is especially important if you're going to use torches on the system to make some sort of a repair. So the process would be recover the refrigerant, do a nitrogen sweep, and then go about making your repair, especially if you're using torches. I would also add that if you're using torches, it's industry best practice to go ahead and take that recovery tank and move it away from the job site. With that, I'd like to hand it off to Michael.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk a little bit about the refrigerant driving license, which is a program intended to be globally recognized and acceptable to qualify technicians and to set a minimum requirement for the proper and safe management of next generation refrigerants in our industry. The context of the RDL is, of course, the phase down of HFCs under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And it's targeted more, the program's targeted more to developing countries, also known as A5 countries in the Montreal Protocol. So if a country already has a program, great. If it doesn't, it can look to the RDL program as a basis for its own program. And we've already been in touch with several countries, and we're doing a pilot, as you'll see in a moment. But also we understand, we expect strong growth in middle-class citizens of the world, and we're going to see a lot of growth in our sector and a lot of need for comfort cooling and all the services and comforts that our industry provides to citizens. So it's really important that we're training technicians in countries all over the world on safety and on environmental aspects of refrigerant handling, whether it's the proper installation and towards the end of life and servicing. Not to mention that proper installation will have a great impact on energy efficiency as well. So we've launched a pilot with 6 countries to beta test the curriculum in the exam that we've developed. The first task of the pilot was to train local trainers and have train the trainer sessions And so once these local trainers were qualified by passing themselves the RDL exam, each country will complete its own training of technicians for the RDL. The COVID-19 resulted in a delay of finishing the pilot. We got through, we had a train the trainer session in 5 of the 6 countries, but we're now considering perhaps finishing the pilot with virtual trainings. So we're looking into that at the moment. You can turn to the next slide, please. We're going to talk about the scope of the RDL. So in terms of the equipment that's covered, we have the different categories A, B, and C. Currently, we're working in the pilot with category A, which is essentially residential type units. And potentially we're going to afterwards develop curriculum and exams for commercial products. We also understand that manufacturers are directly involved in the training of technicians for larger units. So we started with residential units to try to as the low-hanging fruit, if you will. And this slide also gives you an outline of how the program is structured. Each category has its own set of topics, and then each of those can be a theoretical or a practical competency gauge, and then whether it's a theoretical question like a written question, or whether it's a practical exam, we're testing for a skill or a task, and then the questions themselves will each stem from the skill or the task that we're testing. So we developed the curriculum with a pool of experts, starting with a job task analysis. So we broke down the skills specific to each particular task, including factors as the task frequency and the duration, and the environmental factors and the equipment required. And so that guided the exam, the creation of the exam. The scope of the RDL also, you could say it targets technicians with experience in refrigerant management. So they're not fresh off the street, beginning technicians. We're targeting technicians that do have some experience in the field and now need to get trained in these new refrigerants in terms of safety and environmental handling. And it covers both flammable and non-flammable refrigerants. There's some similarities in how you handle those refrigerants, but there are key differences. So we're really covering both because there's a safety aspect and an environmental aspect. So we're really trying to solve both of those at the same time. It will focus on containment techniques as well, both for conventional refrigerants and safety techniques for alternative refrigerants. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a flow chart just showing how the pilot was devised, but there'll be some similarities once launched. At the top is the administrator. So this is just the organization that administers the program. Currently, AHRI and UN Environment are the administrators, but at some point we'll have to think about perhaps a third, a new organization coming in to administer this program. So the administrator provides the RDL curriculum, which includes an agenda for the training, a syllabus, a study guide for technicians to take home with them, a series of PowerPoints that would be given during the trainings. And we provide this curriculum to master trainers, and we got 4 master trainers that are international experts in the field. We sent them to the pilot countries to train the local trainers, and which they were given basically a basically a proxy of the actual training. You know, they actually did the training, but they also had some separate sessions where they would be doing mock trainings themselves. And so if they passed, then they were able to be the local trainers. If they passed the exam, the written exam, and they also took a practical exam. So then those local trainers will go on and train a number of technicians during the pilot, and then potentially they will be the trainers that will carry on into the launched program. In terms of the number of days, it's a 3-day program, and you on days 1 and 2 you cover theoretical and practical training, and then on the 3rd day you would have the testing portion, which would be the written test of 100 questions. And we've allotted 2.5 hours for that multiple choice test, and then the second half is the practical exam. So it's a 3-day program. We decided to do a pilot to catch any potential problems, to test the possible roles of the actors involved. Of course, the country government is involved in the pilot, and they've helped us out quite a bit. We're trying to manage the risks of launching a final program as much as we can, and to better calculate the costs of the pilot. And one of the concerns that came up in the pilot so far is that the performance of the technicians on a whole has been less than we would have hoped for. It's been some poor performance that have come out from the pilot, and we're trying still to understand why. You know, it could be that technicians are not used to sitting down and taking a multiple choice test of 100 questions. It could be because we did the pilot in English that maybe there's some language barriers in certain countries that have multiple languages. Maybe some people, maybe everybody speaks some amount of English, but there's also a number of local languages that are spoken. So that's a possible reason. And we understand, we got some feedback on some regional differences in the terminology. So we're trying to understand exactly why the technicians in the pilot have not done as well, and certainly we want to make it a very robust program, and to gauge the actual competency, but we don't want to you know, make it impossible. But we don't feel that way at this point. We're trying to understand why the questions were. And we did testing of the questions. I mean, we got a pool of experts, and we used a method to gauge the difficulty of questions, and we did an analysis on that. So, like I said, we're still understanding that reason. Some other pending questions that we have for the RDL are whether we're going to continue and do the commercial equipment categories B and C, as I mentioned, going beyond the residential equipment. Another question is the translation from English into a variety of languages, starting with major world languages, French and Spanish and Chinese, and maybe perhaps a few others. We understand that there's going to be a cost to this, especially if you want a quality translation of technical terms. So that would be a next important phase, just to take this beyond English, is to translate it into major world languages. Another big question is who will administer the program going forward, and who will try to make a business out of this, essentially. I mean, we want the technicians to have a demand for this program, and to feel proud for having the RDL badge on their shoulder. But there might be a reason to create a mandate. Certain countries might want to make a policy that mandates this, similar to other programs that they've done in other countries, that they have a certain license for handling refrigerants, and particularly ones that are flammable or toxic. So that's a big question of who's going to administer the program, and the nature of the program, whether whether it will be an off-the-shelf optional resource that countries can use as they see fit. They can adopt the program, they can use the curriculum in the exam and have be given license to do that, and then adapt it however they like. Or is the RDL going to be a centralized, consistent program across the country, so that if you see an RDL certification in Malaysia, does that compare to an RDL certification in Uganda? That's an important question, because developing and ensuring that consistency perhaps could be very difficult. You'd have to go through different accreditations to make sure that the equipment provided is the same, the assessors are not using any subjectivity when they're assessing the practical aspects of charging a unit or evacuating a unit or brazing, whatever the case is. So that's still a question before we launch the program. So that gave you a little bit of a flavor of what we're doing to try to facilitate a safe transition to alternative refrigerants, and we're happy to answer any questions, whether it's here and during the webinar or offline. You have my email in the intro. So without further ado, I'd like to just hand it over to Tony, and he can give his presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm just giving you an update about what Nate is doing for 2Ls coming up. So Nate began work on a low GWP refrigerant certification exam a couple of years ago. So far, we've completed the job task analysis, which is a list of the job skills and job knowledge areas that a technician would need to know or do to properly service equipment competently. And we also completed the validation survey of that job task analysis, which rates each one of those job task statements, both by their frequency and how critical they are to a technician completing their job. Using that survey, we were able to create an exam blueprint. However, instead of releasing a certification exam here in the US, we used that exam blueprint to assist in the development of the RDL, the Refrigerant Driving License certification that Michael was just speaking to you about. We also use that to create a study guide for that RDL program. Coming up, we're finishing the development of that certification exam this year. Currently, we just need to finish writing new items, which are the exam questions, putting together that exam form, and then doing a standard setting, which sets the passing score for that certification exam. That will all be completed over the summer and into the fall. And we'll be launching that certification exam and study guide both on October 4th of this year. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Mary.
Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased. We had a great set of conversations here. So what I really want folks to take away from today, Technician 2L training is available, and while A2L refrigerants will be handled similarly to A1 refrigerants, training is the best path to excellence, right? Technician training is available through several training organizations. We've presented 3 different organizations here. Although the RDL is for outside of the US, there's other training organizations that will be in the US and have training available. It's available in a variety of platforms, digital, online, paper, training seminars, conferences, and more technician training is coming online. Equipment OEMs are also expected to have individualized equipment training. So it's an exciting time, and there's a wide berth of information that's out there. Next slide, please. And just to let you know some of the resources that we have available to assist you in anything you're looking for. We have the AHRI, Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. We have a website, webinars, we have the newsletter. We're putting more content on every single day. So I'm very excited and happy that you all came with us today. And now we're going to go and answer a few questions that came in. I'm going to answer one or two, and then I'm going to flip some of the questions over to Jason. One of the questions that came up was regarding the IMC and UMC. The question was, won't A2Ls need to be incorporated into the ICC and UMC before these systems will be accepted? So just want to let folks know that states and local jurisdictions are able to adopt safety standards directly into their building codes or adopt model codes such as the ICC and UMC. So there's that option. It's been happening for years. Both Florida and Washington State have adopted safety standards into the state codes, enabling the use of A2L refrigerants. So that's why this training is so timely. Another question came out regarding cylinders, and folks were asking, hey, where can I get these recovery cylinders and where can they be purchased? So the scoop is recovery cylinders are very generic, and certified recovery cylinders can be purchased from general supply houses. What folks have been doing is they've been putting on the marking on it, the flammable symbol that can be also got at these kind of supply houses, and marking the refrigerant that's on it, and also marking the symbol on there. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. I think there were a couple other questions that came out going over the purging and other things. So Jason, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mary. All right, so there were a few questions that came in. One of them said, if the A2L gas is removed from the system and another charge is planned to go into the same system, does the nitrogen purge still apply? And the answer is, it depends on what you're doing to the system, why the charge was removed in the first place. If you're removing the charge to cut open the system or to make a repair, then yes, the purge still applies. I would also point out that we're looking to put the exact same charge back in the system. It may not be the exact same refrigerant that was recovered, but we're not converting the system from one charge to another. Another question that came in was, is the M1 charge always or necessarily less than the M2 charge? In most instances, the M1 charge, and again, the M1 is a charge without mitigation installed, is lower than the M2 charge by installing mitigation, by installing sensors, fans, ventilation, pump downs, and things that allows the charge to be larger. Now, there can be an instance, depending on the system design, the heat transfer surfaces, the efficiency, is it a package unit, is it a split unit, that sort of thing, where the M1 and M2 may be the same. But in most instances, the M1 will be less than the M2. There was, I believe, one more question to answer. Oh, some manufacturers in the literature are using floor area instead of cubic volume. I'll tell you that the standards lay out a formula to calculate the required airspace for a charge. And those formulas use cubic volume. Now, manufacturers may extrapolate that data from cubic volume over to floor area based on the occupancy class that's the system is approved, tested, and listed for. So there'll be some instances where manufacturers will list a cubic volume as in the sample chart we showed here. And there'll be other instances where they extrapolate the data using the formulas laid out in the standards and just give you floor area. Are there any other questions coming in?
Well, this is Helen Mulgitaranoni, the VP of Regulatory Affairs at AHRI. I thought I'd maybe answer some of these EPA questions for people, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's a couple questions here about, you know, my goodness, why are we having this conversation? Do we really need to use these A2L refrigerants? And so the answer to that is this. So in case you're unaware, there have been some regulations moving forward around refrigerant use in air conditioning for the past couple of years. In California, for example, they are contemplating and probably finalizing soon a regulation that will require a transition to a 750 global warming potential GWP limit for refrigerants and air conditioning equipment by 2025 for large charge sizes, so unitary, et cetera, and for smaller charge sizes in 2023. And so because there are no other solutions available, that will drive the use of A2L refrigerants. In addition, there is a legislation sitting on Governor Inslee's desk in Washington State that will require the same thing, a transition to a 750 global warming potential limit in 2025. And then finally, at the national level, at the EPA, there is a phase down in the use of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, nationally. The American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, the AIM Act, was signed into law by President Trump last year. That requires this phase down. It's along the same schedule as the HFC amendment, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And so that will require a phase down and a transition for air conditioning. We believe it'll be around 2025, aligning with Washington State and California. In that transition, again, people will need to be prepared for that change. So I just wanted to make mention of that, although the A1s are available today, there will come a time when, with the transition, that it is very likely that we'll all need to be prepared for using A2L refrigerants. And so want to make sure that we are communicating with everyone in the supply chain to ensure that there are options available. We have heard of an option that might be below 750, like the 466A option. However, it's not commercial yet, and we don't know if it will be. So again, we're just trying to make sure that everyone is prepared. Many of the large OEMs have announced that they plan to use an A2L in their equipment. And so again, we just want to make sure that there's a level of readiness throughout the entire supply chain for technicians and contractors and equipment manufacturers, folks that maintain equipment, that everybody's ready for this change. So that's the reason that we're having this communication. I would also note that if you are interested in the policy part of this, we did have a webinar on Tuesday around this issue, and that we can certainly share the link to that webinar if people would like more information around that. Jason, I think there's a question here around, there's a couple more questions here.
I can see them, yep.
Yep, okay, go ahead.
All right, one of the questions brought up was retrofitting. These newer refrigerants, I shouldn't say newer to us, because they're widely used around the world. We cannot retrofit a system from one class to another. So A2L refrigerants are going to be charged into systems that were designed for A2L refrigerants and were tested and listed and approved using A2Ls. You can't go from an A1 to an A2L or from an A2 back to an A1. Retrofitting across flammability classes is not allowed. One of the other questions was the charges. Now I see there's a comment in here about the charges being less than 150 grams, and that's typically for A3 refrigerants. A2L refrigerant charges we're going to see in the pounds, 4 pounds, 5 pounds, 6 pounds, something along those lines. But there are specific A3 scales out there. There are that have a very small accuracy swing and that are specifically used for the propanes and the isobutanes and those things. But the A2L charge is not limited to that small of a charge. They're limited to, again, with or without mitigation and what they're tested for.
Mary, maybe
ahead.
Jason, this is Helen again. Let me just jump in. Mary, we should probably, there's a question here around comparing the new refrigerants to the old refrigerants in terms of flammability and safety. And there's a question here around whether or not there are safety standards in place yet for the use of A2L refrigerants in air conditioning equipment. And I don't know if you'd like to maybe.
Sure. I'd like to go with that. So let me just go with the, and I saw there were a couple out there on 1234YF and 1234ZE. So let me start with that one. There's been widespread acceptance of 1234YF and 1234ZE. Those are both AHRI class A2L. I want to say 60 to 80% of the vehicles sold right now in North America have 1234YF in them. So that's a great amount of acceptance story. 1234ZE, we're seeing a lot of that in chillers and other applications. Regarding the relative safety, so the toxicity, both class A, the flammability, really A1s aren't non-flammable. It means that they don't, the flame doesn't propagate in terms of an ignition, whereas the 2Ls have a slight propagation, and the reason they're a new class is because they're considered low flammability, slow-moving refrigerants if they are ignited. There's been copious amounts of work done. We have multiple research projects that have been completed on AHRI's website. You can take a look at those. Work we just did with the fire service. So I would say very comparable safety risk. Then talking about standards, the equipment standard, UL 2-40, it's also called UL 60335-2-40, that encompasses A2L specifically as a call-out class, was published in December 2019, so that's already coming up on its 2-year mark. AHRI 15 and 15.2 have included information regarding A2L refrigerants. So again, we've got a lot going on and a lot of stuff has been published and it's already in the standards. So I hope that answers a lot of the questions out there on that.
There was
Mary,
one other, okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jason.
There was some questions surrounding the tools. Yes, it's going to be required. Tools that you're using with this equipment be approved for, or there's compatible with, or listed for use with A2L refrigerants.
There's a couple of policy questions here. So this is Helen. I'll take those. So there was a question around the use, the fact that A2Ls do contain HFCs or are an HFC. So the HFC transition under the AIM Act is a phase down and not a phase out, which means that HFCs can continue to be used long term. However, they're depending on their global warming potential, their GWP, that will be an indicator of how much is allowed to be used nationally. So I hope that that answers this question. There was a question around retrofitting equipment. So for example, you can retrofit an A1 to an A1, and perhaps you might be able to retrofit an A2L to an A2L, but EPA will determine that, and there will be very strict rules and guidance around that in coming regulations. And we anticipate, so SNAP rule, the EPA Significant New Alternatives Policy Program, the SNAP program is where refrigerants are listed, and we anticipate that that they will have SNAP Rule 23 out here in the coming weeks or a few months here, allowing the use of A2L refrigerants. And they have requirements about following the safety standards, labeling, and other requirements in their rules around refrigerants with flammability. Mary, are there any others that you wanted to answer? Or do we have time to answer? I know we're
I think we're getting very short on time. I think I did hear this one was answered, but I think there were some questions about pump down equipment, so vacuum pumps. I think one of the things we've been discussing at the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force is that we're seeing a lot of equipment out there already that's got information on it that there's pumps, gauges, and equipment available from several different vendors, supply manufacturers that have the manifold gauge sets, that have vacuum pumps, and that have leak detectors, handheld leak detectors, and all the pieces of equipment ready for A2L. So it looks like the industry is ready for this transition. And now we see that we have lots of training coming where it's been online and more even coming online. So I think we've answered most of the questions, and I know more questions are coming in, and we'll continue to answer those. Maybe one or two more, Helen, or
hey,
Mary, yeah,
maybe I could tackle, there's a couple of questions coming in for Canada, so maybe we could just tackle those, a couple of those right quick. So there's some questions around training for Canada, and I can tell you that we are working with our Canadian sister organization, AHRI, on similar efforts. So, you know, Mary mentioned the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force, looking at all of these issues. And so, you know, I certainly expect to see similar availability of training and perhaps an RDL type situation for Canada. We'll know more in the coming, months as to the direction that they take, but we certainly are certainly working toward an answer for that. There were also questions around, a couple of questions around the codes in Canada. So I just wanted to mention, so somebody asked about the refrigerant concentration limit criteria that's used in CSA. It's also used in AHRI standards and in the building codes, and that is followed. And there is the table, the refrigerant concentration limit is based, it tells you how much refrigerant concentration you can have in a space, and it's based on either toxicity or flammability. Those limitations are listed in AHRI 34 and adopted by UL and CSA and into model building codes in the US. And those tables do contain A2L refrigerants as well as A1. So I hope that that answers that question. Mary, I don't know if there's others that you'd like that you can pick up, or if we're running out of time.
I see some on other topics on the A2L, and again, I think we've answered a lot of those that M1 is definitely less than M2. Some of them on the EN378, I'm sorry, I'm not really quite sure exactly what that attendee is asking us, but we'll definitely, if you email us, we'll definitely look to answer these. But I think if we go through these, we've answered most of them, and we're very close to running out. Or what did you say?
I see one more question that I'd like to go ahead and answer.
Sure.
There's a lot here. We're not going to get through all of them. Of course, we're going to run out of time, but there is a question here about experience on the use of A2L refrigerants and service enterprises managing these refrigerants in other countries. So just for information, a couple of statistics for you. In the United States, more than 90% of new cars, new automobiles, contain an A2L refrigerant in their air conditioning system. Around the world, for example, in Australia, where they had some very high carbon taxes a few years ago, they have made a significant number of transitions for air conditioning, especially equipment. Europe as well, and Japan, Thailand, and other countries, even developing nations, are using A2L refrigerants. I would mention that we have not found any issues from a safety perspective around A2L refrigerants, and they have varying servicing training requirements. So, for example, in Australia, you actually have to have a license to purchase an HFC, hydrofluorocarbon. So to purchase the refrigerant, you've got to have a license. They don't have the same stringent requirements for hydrocarbons and other alternatives. So that's kind of how that is handled. And certainly other countries have different requirements there, but the folks have been trained, and they have moved forward with this transition. And certainly we're trying to take the lessons learned from those other countries and apply them here in the US, and make sure that we share them with folks that develop training.
Helen, there's one question here I wanted to address that was speaking of, equipment using A2L refrigerants, are leak detectors and mitigation required? And that all depends on the charge size and the occupancy classification of the building. Standards have laid out at what charge size for which refrigerant mitigation is required. So manufacturers will print, again, in their installation manual that if you exceed this charge, we have to install ventilation or some kind of an isolation or a pump down of some sort. So it's not necessarily required if you're within the M1 charge. If you're going to exceed the M1 charge, then yes, mitigation becomes required. If you move into different occupancy classes, into commercial or industrial, sensors and leak detectors and those sorts of things are almost always required, even if it's an A1. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. No, thank you, Jason. That's very, very helpful. So I think we certainly see the use of A2Ls around the world safely. We've seen them in cars and in air conditioning equipment, in even commercial refrigeration equipment with larger charge sizes. in chillers. And so we are certainly trying to take the lessons learned around the world and apply them here in the US and share that information with all of you. Mary, I know we're out of time, so let me let you go ahead and close.
No, I think that's perfect. I really appreciate it. I want to say thank you to everyone who had the chance to join us today. This will be posted in our webinar series on YouTube. Appreciate all the questions. We'll try and get back to everyone as best we can for any questions we didn't answer today. Really thank our 3 industry experts for providing us an overview of the topics that we know are near and dear to your heart. And please keep looking at the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force and look for more content that's coming up on our website. We really appreciate this interactive opportunity, so please don't be a stranger and connect with us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.